The sky above the Pacific was supposed to be theirs. But on that morning, the Japanese pilots saw something they hadn't prepared for, a horizon crawling with aircraft. Not dozens, not scores, hundreds. Engines roared like thunder rolling across the ocean, one after another, wave after wave. Radios crackled with disbelief. More planes? Where are they all coming from? In that instant, they understood. The Americans weren't defending anymore. They were hunting. And the ocean itself had turned into a floating airfield. December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor had changed everything. Japan's Imperial Navy had struck with precision and audacity, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a matter of hours. Six carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sori, Hairi, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, had proven that sea power no longer rested on battleships, but on aircraft launched from floating runways. For months afterward, Japanese naval officers believed their dominance of the Pacific was absolute. By early 1942, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force roamed the ocean almost unchallenged. Every island fortress that stood in their path seemed to fall. Guam, Wake, the Philippines. Reports flowing back to Tokyo were filled with confidence. American morale, they assumed, had been shattered beyond repair. Yet far to the east, on the U.S. mainland, a very different war machine was awakening. Shipyards along the West Coast worked day and night, welding steel hulls under floodlights that burned brighter than daylight. The Americans weren't simply rebuilding what they had lost, they were multiplying it. For every carrier Japan had, the United States planned to build several more. By the spring of 1942, those plans were already bearing fruit. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown stood ready in the Pacific, soon joined by newly completed Essex-class carriers whose decks stretched longer than football fields. Their hangars brimmed with aircraft, Grumman F-4F Wildcats, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBD Devastators, all manned by pilots trained with ruthless efficiency. American naval doctrine had shifted, too. No longer would they send carriers into battle alone. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, now Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had ordered a new strategy: mass coordination. Multiple carriers operating together, launching hundreds of aircraft in synchronized attacks, could overwhelm even the most skilled defenders. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence underestimated the scale of what was coming. Their scouts believed the Americans could field only a handful of operational carriers, a fraction of the truth. That miscalculation would soon lead to one of the most shocking realizations in naval history. The stage was set in the vast, empty waters near Midway Atoll, a speck of land that would soon witness the turning point of the Pacific War. June 4th, 1942. Dawn broke over the Pacific like a blade of light cutting through mist. Japanese carrier decks came alive. Deck crews moved in precise rhythm, fueling and arming their planes for what they believed would be another swift victory. Midway was the target. The plan: crush the remaining American presence in the region before the U.S. could recover. But something was wrong. At 4:30 a.m., radar stations on Midway Island picked up faint echoes, aircraft heading straight for them. Alarms blared. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their posts. American bombers and fighters roared off the tiny airstrips, their tires barely clearing the coral runway. The Japanese carriers struck first, pounding the island with explosions that shook the sand and smoke into the morning sky. As Nagumo's strike group returned to rearm, officers crowded around the flag bridge of Akagi. Reports began flooding in. Enemy carriers sighted northeast. The message was vague, but it chilled the command deck. American carriers? Here? That wasn't supposed to happen. By the time scouts confirmed the sighting, it was too late. The ocean to the northeast shimmered with sunlight and something else. Dots on the horizon, then hundreds of them. From the decks of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, The Americans were launching everything they had: bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, a continuous stream pouring into the sky. The sea around the carriers churned with wake trails and jet black exhaust. To the Japanese lookouts, it looked impossible. "How many carriers do they have?" one officer whispered. The answer came not in words, but in the roar of engines approaching from every direction. The hunters of Pearl Harbor were about to become the hunted. On the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood rigid, binoculars pressed against his eyes. The horizon flickered with sunlight, but what he saw wasn't reflections, it was formations. Tight, disciplined, endless formations. American planes, climbing, turning, diving in perfect sequence. He lowered the binoculars, his jaw locked. "Impossible," murmured Commander Minoru Genda beside him. "They can't launch that many." A communications officer rushed in, breathless. "Admiral, our scouts confirmed 3, possibly 4 enemy carriers. Their aircraft are inbound in waves." Nagumo didn't respond immediately. He turned toward the flight deck below, a sea of motion, crews struggling to refuel and rearm bombers that had just returned from the Midway strike. The air stank of gasoline. Torpedoes and bombs lay exposed on the deck, waiting to be loaded. It was the worst possible moment to face a counterattack. He glanced at his operations officer. "We strike again, immediately." "Sir, the planes are not ready. We need time to." "There is no time," Nagumo snapped. "If we hesitate, they'll reach us first." Every second now carried weight. Below deck, mechanics worked frantically, cursing under their breath as they swapped torpedoes for armor-piercing bombs. Sweat streaked across their faces, mixing with oil and gunpowder dust. Orders shouted in rapid succession echoed through the carrier's corridors. Genda leaned close, his voice low. "Admiral, what if they have more carriers beyond the horizon? What if this is only part of their force?" Nagumo's gaze drifted toward the east. The sea stretched endlessly, calm, indifferent. He knew that hesitation could doom them, but so could haste. His instincts warred with his orders. He turned sharply. "Signal all carriers. Prepare for immediate counterstrike. Fighters to the air. Protect the fleet." A chorus of acknowledgments crackled over the radio. Kaga, Sori, and Hairi moved in formation, each deck preparing for launch. Yet deep down, every officer aboard those ships knew they were racing against a clock they couldn't see. Above them, contrails began to appear, long white scars across the sky. The first wave of American bombers was closing in. Nagumo's final order before the attack began was barely audible. "May the gods favor us." But the gods were silent, and the ocean was about to answer. The battle unfolded across more than 1,000,000 square miles of ocean, an expanse so vast that entire fleets could vanish beyond the curve of the earth. Yet on that morning of June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sori, and Hairi, found themselves at the center of a tightening circle. Against them stood 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, supported by 233 aircraft, with dozens more stationed on Midway Island itself. From 7 a.m. onward, the sky turned into a battleground layered in altitude and chaos. At sea level, torpedo bombers skimmed the waves, their propellers inches above the water, while at 15,000 feet, dive bombers circled like hawks waiting for a signal to strike. Each Japanese carrier carried roughly 70 to 80 planes, giving Nagumo's force a total of 248 operational aircraft. But what he didn't know was that Nimitz's carriers had coordinated their launches with near-mechanical precision, creating a relentless sequence of attacks. The first waves of American torpedo squadrons suffered devastating losses. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet went in without fighter cover. Out of 15 devastators, all but 1 were destroyed before reaching their target. Not a single torpedo found its mark, but their sacrifice wasn't in vain. As the low-flying bombers drew the Japanese combat air patrol down toward the ocean, the sky above them cleared. That was when the real hammer fell. At 10:22 a.m., 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown broke through the clouds at nearly 20,000 feet. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours, running dangerously low on fuel. Then, through a break in the cloud cover, they saw it, the unmistakable gray silhouettes of three enemy carriers, their decks crowded with fully armed planes, fuel hoses snaking across like veins. Lieutenant Commander Wade M. C. Kluski, leading the Enterprise group, gave the order, attack. The first bombs fell less than a minute later. On Kaga, a direct hit struck the flight deck near midship. Fuel lines erupted in flame. A second bomb penetrated to the hangar deck, detonating torpedoes and stored ammunition. The explosion tore through the carrier, sending smoke hundreds of feet into the sky. Nearby, Akagi tried to turn hard to port, but her deck was already aflame. One bomb had hit near the command center, killing dozens instantly. A second explosion followed as burning fuel ignited planes still loaded with ordnance. At 10:25 a.m., in the span of just 5 minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Sari were mortally wounded. Three of Japan's most powerful carriers, gone before they could even launch their counterstrike. The shock rippled through the Japanese formation. Hyrie, still untouched, launched her planes in a desperate retaliation. Her dive bombers found Yorktown around noon, scoring multiple hits that set her ablaze and forced her crew to abandon ship. Yet even then, American coordination held firm. Planes from Enterprise and Hornet tracked Hyrie through the smoke and haze, striking her twice before sunset. Flames engulfed her deck, and by nightfall, she too was sinking. 4 Japanese carriers, over 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 sailors, all lost in a single day. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Japan had entered the battle with naval air superiority. By the end of it, that advantage had vanished entirely. When the last fires burned out over the Pacific, the numbers told the story plainly. The Japanese Navy had lost 2/3 of its carrier strength in less than 6 hours. The Americans, by contrast, lost 1 carrier and 307 men. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted, not slowly, not gradually, but violently, in a single, irreversible moment. What stunned the Japanese survivors most wasn't just defeat. It was how fast it happened. One moment, they believed they ruled the air. The next, they realized their enemy could launch hundreds of planes, coordinate them across vast distances, and strike with precision that defied everything they had imagined. Midway wasn't just a battle. It was proof that the tide of the Pacific War had turned, and it would never turn back. As the smoke drifted across the Pacific, fragments of disbelief spread through every surviving Japanese vessel. Reports came in, first a trickle, then a flood. Akagi aflame, Kaga sinking. Sori lost contact. Each message hit the fleet like a hammer. Officers stared at the radio sets, unable to speak. The survivors of Torpedo Squadron 8, the few who had ditched in the water, were picked up hours later by passing destroyers. When debriefed, one pilot simply said, "They just kept coming. Every time we thought they were done, another wave appeared." That was the first realization. The Americans could coordinate mass attacks with terrifying rhythm. But a second, deeper truth followed. They could replace what they lost. Every aircraft that went down could be rebuilt. Every fallen pilot had a trained replacement ready to fly. Aboard Hyrie, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi studied the burning horizon in silence. His staff waited for orders, but his eyes stayed fixed on the columns of smoke where 3 carriers once stood. "So this," he murmured, "is what industrial war looks like." No one replied. They didn't need to. Hours later, when Hyrie herself came under attack, The shock wasn't only from the bombs tearing through her decks, it was from the realization that American planes had returned again and again without pause. Where were they all coming from? How many carriers could the United States possibly field? The answer was more than Japan could ever match. In Tokyo, High Command wouldn't learn the full scope of the disaster for days. When the reports finally arrived, an admiral at Naval Headquarters reportedly whispered, 4 carriers. In one day? He paused, looking at the floor. Then the war is already decided. The truth was spreading, not just across the ocean, but through the hearts of those who had once believed themselves invincible. The Empire's air wings had been built on precision and pride. What they faced now was something else entirely, a force that could outproduce, outfly, and outlast them. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan's naval command realized the Pacific was no longer theirs. The destruction of Japan's carrier force at Midway was more than a military defeat. It was a strategic fracture that changed the entire course of the Pacific War. Before June 1942, Japan's Imperial Navy had held the initiative. Its fleet had struck from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific with precision and confidence. But after Midway, that momentum collapsed, replaced by a slow and irreversible decline. The losses went beyond the 4 sunk carriers. Each ship represented years of construction, scarce resources, and most critically, the loss of Japan's most experienced aviators. The 248 aircraft destroyed were devastating enough, but the pilots who perished with them were irreplaceable. Many had been veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. Their training had taken years, and Japan's aviation program couldn't produce replacements at the same pace as the United States. America, on the other hand, had just proven the full power of industrial warfare. Shipyards in San Francisco, Newport News, and Brooklyn were already rolling out a new generation of Essex-class carriers, faster, larger, and designed for rapid aircraft deployment. In 1942 alone, American factories built more than 47,000 aircraft. Japan produced fewer than 9,000. The difference was staggering. Midway also exposed a critical flaw in Japan's naval doctrine: rigidity. Nagumo's hesitation in rearming his planes, torn between attacking Midway again or striking at the approaching carriers, cost him the element of timing. The Americans, under Nimitz' new doctrine, had abandoned that rigidity. Carriers no longer acted as lone instruments of power. They moved in coordinated task groups, multiple decks, dozens of squadrons, and hundreds of aircraft could now act as one weapon. This doctrine became the foundation of American carrier warfare for the rest of the century. By operating in groups, they could maintain constant pressure, one wave launching while another recovered, ensuring that the enemy never had a moment to reorganize. For Japan, the aftermath of Midway was a quiet reckoning. In the weeks that followed, the Imperial Navy attempted to conceal the true scale of its losses from the public. Radio broadcasts spoke of a setback, not a catastrophe. Yet within the naval staff, the truth was clear. Japan had lost not only ships, but strategic initiative. From that point onward, every campaign would be reactive. The tactical lessons of Midway reverberated through naval academies worldwide. Speed of decision-making, intelligence accuracy, and operational coordination became the new pillars of warfare at sea. The days of battleships dueling with visible guns were over. Victory now depended on command decisions made hundreds of miles away, often guided only by radio and instinct. For the Americans, Midway became the model for future operations: Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and eventually the push toward Japan itself. The ability to launch and recover hundreds of aircraft in tight synchronization had proven decisive. Japan's defeat at Midway wasn't sealed by a single bomb or explosion. It was sealed by a failure to understand what modern war had become: a contest of endurance, coordination, and production. The battle revealed that air power, not steel, ruled the ocean. From that day forward, Japan would never again mount an offensive on that scale. The empire that had once dominated the Pacific now fought to defend what little it had left, while across the ocean, the Americans had just begun to realize the extent of their strength. For the men who survived Midway, the memory of that day never faded. Survivors from Akagi and Kalga spoke years later of the silence that followed the explosions, not the roar of engines or fire, but the hollow stillness of watching the sea swallow what had been the pride of the Imperial Navy. Hundreds floated in oil-slicked water, clinging to wreckage as the sun set behind pillars of smoke. The Pacific, once their domain, now felt vast and foreign. Many officers who had believed in Japan's invincibility were forced to confront an unbearable truth. The empire's finest aviators, trained through years of discipline and sacrifice, had been wiped out in hours by an enemy they had underestimated. In the words of one surviving pilot, recorded after the war, "We looked to the horizon for help that would never come. The sea was full of shadows, but none were ours." On the American side, the feeling was no less complex. Sailors aboard Enterprise in Yorktown cheered as plumes of smoke rose in the distance, but the victory came at a cost they could see and smell: burned fuel, twisted metal, the silence of missing wingmen. In the ready rooms, chairs sat empty. On the decks, names were crossed off rosters. The triumph was real, but so was the weight of it. For Admiral Nimitz, the win at Midway was a validation of strategy, yet he knew it marked only the beginning. "We were lucky," he told his staff, "but luck favors those who prepare." Beneath his calm exterior was a recognition that this battle had tested not only machines and tactics, but human endurance, the capacity to learn faster than the enemy. In Japan, the psychological fracture ran deeper. Officers wrote in coded journals, afraid to speak openly about what they knew, that the tide had turned. Letters home spoke not of glory, but of uncertainty. "The sky no longer belongs to us," one pilot wrote to his wife. "It feels strange to admit it." The human cost of Midway went beyond the dead. It reshaped the living, commanders questioning their judgment, pilots haunted by the faces of men they couldn't save, engineers realizing that bravery could no longer compensate for lost time and dwindling resources. The lesson was bitter but undeniable. War had changed. No amount of tradition or discipline could stand against the power of coordination, technology, and scale. The myth of invincibility had drowned with the carriers, leaving behind a generation of sailors and pilots who had seen the limits of courage against the machinery of modern war. Midway didn't end the war, it transformed it. In the months that followed, the Pacific became a chessboard of shifting power. Japan, though wounded, was not finished. The Imperial Navy regrouped, desperate to regain momentum. Their next gamble came in August 1942, when Japanese troops clashed with U.S. Marines on a small, jungle-covered island called Guadalcanal. The Americans landed with limited supplies and uncertain objectives. What began as a bold offensive soon turned into a brutal test of endurance. The Japanese, determined to reclaim the island, launched relentless night attacks by sea and air. Each side fought not only the enemy, but hunger, disease, and exhaustion. In the skies above Guadalcanal, a new reality set in. The U.S. Navy now operated with growing coordination, their carriers cycling squadrons in precise timing. For every zero that rose from Rabaul, 3 Wildcats or Dauntlesses met it head-on. Pilots who once feared Japanese superiority now spoke of even fights, and sometimes easy kills. The training reforms initiated after Midway were beginning to show results. At sea, the battles became more complex. Radar-guided operations allowed U.S. task forces to strike under cover of darkness, a tactic that stunned the Japanese, who had long dominated night warfare. In one exchange near Savo Island, Japanese cruisers inflicted heavy damage, but they also lost precious fuel and ships they could not replace. The attrition war had begun, and Japan was bleeding resources it no longer had the industry to recover. Back in Tokyo, High Command faced internal rifts. Admiral Yamamoto pushed for one last decisive confrontation to break American momentum. Others urged a defensive stance, conserving ships for homeland defense. The tension between honor and pragmatism split the Navy's leadership, a quiet conflict as dangerous as any fought on open water. Meanwhile, in the United States, the industrial machine surged forward. Shipyards on both coasts worked around the clock, launching new carriers faster than Japan could sink them. The Essex-class carriers began appearing larger, faster, and capable of launching even more aircraft than the Enterprise or Hornet. The balance of naval power was no longer shifting, it had shifted. Each clash after Midway, the Solomon Islands, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, carried echoes of that first great shock. The Japanese fleet continued to fight with discipline and courage, but the strategic momentum had vanished. What Midway had revealed was not just a lost battle, but a lost future. By late 1943, Japan's naval pilots were being trained in a fraction of the time once required. The veterans of Pearl Harbor were gone, replaced by boys who barely knew the controls of their aircraft. The empire that had once defined mastery of the skies was now losing pilots faster than it could teach them to fly. The ripples of Midway were everywhere, in the empty docks of Yokosuka, the crowded barracks of San Diego, and the restless silence before every new operation. The Pacific War had entered its second phase, one where Japan would fight not for expansion, but for survival. The turning point arrived not in a single moment, but in a realization, one that echoed from Tokyo's war rooms to the decks of U.S. carriers moving steadily westward. Midway had not just been a tactical defeat, it was the unraveling of an entire doctrine, the myth of Japanese naval supremacy. In early 1944, that truth became impossible to deny. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, now equipped with the new Essex-class carriers, formed massive task forces unlike anything the world had ever seen. Task Force 58, Admiral Mark Mitcher commanding, sailed with over a dozen carriers, hundreds of support ships, and nearly 1,000 aircraft. To the Japanese observers watching from distant islands, the horizon itself seemed to move. By June, the fleet closed in on the Marianas. Operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, would bring American forces within bomber range of Tokyo. The Japanese High Command, desperate and proud, decided to commit everything they had left. Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet steamed toward the Philippine Sea, determined to crush the American advance and reclaim lost honor. But what awaited them was not a repeat of Midway. It was something far greater, an industrial force refined by experience, commanded by officers who had studied every mistake of the past 2 years. June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. At dawn, Japanese reconnaissance spotted what they believed were 4 U.S. carriers. They had no idea there were 15. The radio chatter aboard Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, was strained but hopeful. Pilots lined the decks, veterans and rookies alike, preparing for the largest carrier battle in history. Launch all groups, Ozawa ordered. More than 350 aircraft roared into the sky, Japan's last great carrier strike. But as they approached the American formation, radar screens aboard Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown lit up with hundreds of incoming contacts. The order was calm, almost routine now. Fighter direction, Vector 070. Bogies at 150 miles. Moments later, over 450 Hellcats took flight. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The American pilots, guided by radar and superior coordination, tore through the incoming waves. Japan lost over 300 planes in a single day, their best, their last. The few who returned brought back reports that defied belief. They had hundreds. One shaken pilot told his commander, "We never even reached their carriers." On Taiho, fuel fumes from a ruptured tank ignited after a careless spark. The explosion ripped through the decks. Japan's newest carrier was gone in minutes. Later that day, Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, met the same fate. Ozawa, aboard the damaged Zuikaku, looked out over the sea. The horizon that once promised dominance now burned with the wrecks of his fleet. He turned to his staff and whispered, "We have no fleet left." It was not just a defeat. It was the extinction of Japan's carrier arm. The empire that once dictated the tempo of war had lost its wings forever. On the American ships, there was no celebration, only disbelief at the scale of the victory. Officers realized what this meant. The Pacific was now theirs. For the first time in the war, the U.S. Navy had complete command of the air and sea. The revelation was clear and irreversible. Midway had been the warning. The Philippine Sea was the confirmation. Japan's war in the Pacific was no longer about victory. It was about endurance, how long they could fight before the inevitable reached their shores. As night fell over the burning sea, the surviving Japanese pilots drifted toward home, flying through clouds streaked with smoke and fire. Many never made it back. Those who did landed on shattered runways, stepped from their cockpits, and saluted silently. The Empire's greatest weapon, its pilots, its carriers, its belief in supremacy, had vanished beneath the waves. In the end, it wasn't the might of one battle or one nation that defined the Pacific War. It was the speed of adaptation. At Midway, Japanese pilots had looked out over the ocean and seen something they couldn't yet comprehend. A force capable of launching hundreds of planes in coordinated precision, carriers acting as one vast organism. That sight, the endless horizon of American aircraft, was the beginning of the end. What Japan had built through discipline and daring, the United States eclipsed through scale, innovation, and relentless learning. Midway had stripped away illusions, revealing that courage alone could not win a modern war. It was planning, information, and production, the invisible weapons, that decided the outcome. By 1945, when Japan faced devastation at home, the echoes of Midway still lingered. The men who once believed they ruled the Pacific had learned a final, humbling truth. Supremacy could vanish overnight, and the ocean that once carried their pride could just as easily carry their defeat. The wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu now rest on the seafloor, silent monuments to a turning point in human history. Their twisted steel tells the story better than any words, of ambition, shock, and the moment an empire realized it had met an enemy who could outbuild, outthink, and outlast it. Midway was not just a battle. It was a revelation, the day Japanese pilots looked across the Pacific and saw the future, roaring toward them in waves of steel and fire. Before the waves closed over those burning decks, a message was written in history. Power belongs to those who adapt. If you want more stories like this, where moments of shock reshape the world, make sure to subscribe.